Hi, everyone. We're back with Bryan Sentes, and we're going to sort of continue our conversation from last time, but we'll get into some new things as well. One of the things we sort of touched upon last time, but we didn't get into detail about, was the issue of consciousness. So why do you think that the issue of consciousness is such an important component of ufology, and why is it being increasingly talked about as such within ufological narratives?
Oh, that's a very good question. And of course, a very complex one. Probably the roots of this go back to the 1970s when Jacques Vallee, following Passport to Magonia, was talking about the sort of psychic component of the UFO encounter event. He really played up, focusing on, in part, on Uri Geller, on how many people who have a UFO encounter or experience also report classic psychic or psi phenomena. So they themselves might become precognitive. They might have a precognitive dream. They might experience telepathy with the entities, for example. There's often time dilation. There's sometimes poltergeist effects or telekinetic effects, and so on. So that would be probably one stream whereby this concern with quote unquote consciousness begins to flow into ufology. Another stream has got to do with the Ions Foundation, it seems to me, that was started up by Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut. They have a lot of concern with, again, quote unquote consciousness. There are doubtless other streams that feed into this concern. At least two of them would be the question of the nature of so-called artificial intelligence, which of course raises the question of what is consciousness, what is it to be aware or sentient, as well the sort of more general concern with the question of consciousness that comes up in the wake, for example, of the Matrix movie series, the simulation hypothesis, investigations into brain science, neuroscience, which has been facilitated by advances in technology, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, persistent problems with trying to reduce consciousness or explain consciousness exclusively in third-person physicalist terms. This is what I think it's the philosopher, his name is Chalmers, calls the hard problem of consciousness. Of course, that problem goes back to at least Kant and the people following him. So what you have is a confluence of sort of new age interests in psychic phenomena, a persistence in research into psi phenomena, their relation to ufology, and the more general interest that's there all the way from philosophy down through neuroscience. That would be a very, very rough and not a very well-informed sketch. Do you see any other reasons for this this kind of focus these days?
Perhaps the way that UFOs are sometimes reported to follow the person's thoughts or signals, and that could lead to a kind of notion that UFOs are integrally connected to us.
Yes, I think Greg Bishop has pursued that thought. It's oh dear, it's the not the co-creation hypothesis, but it's something like that. I must apologize to Mr. Bishop for not having that right on the tip of my tongue. But he talks about this a little bit. He sees quote unquote consciousness and the phenomenon as being co-conspirators, as it were, in creating the phenomenon itself.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't say well, okay, let's continue along this line and see where that goes. As someone with a background in philosophy, you can imagine I have some reservations about the way that consciousness is talked about. One should also mention, I should have said this earlier, is that someone else who's been pursuing this line of inquiry is Bernardo Castro, who holds a PhD both in computer science and in philosophy. At the same time, also there's been the renaissance of psychedelic studies. Now that we can look into psychedelics legally, whether it be DMT, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and others, that's also raising questions as to the nature of consciousness and awareness.
Mhm.
So it seems to be a confluence of concerns that we seem ready for, and maybe it's timely. Maybe this is just exactly what we need at this moment of increasingly acute crisis, or at least so it seems to us, eh?
And what's your own view of consciousness, just very broadly?
Well, I mean, okay, I have to take a very sort of critical stance to the way that quote unquote consciousness is talked about. For the most part, people seem mired in the way that Descartes set out the problem. Because in Descartes, there are two kinds of stuff. There's the res extensa, those things that occur in space, and that can be talked about objectively and subject to Newtonian physics. And then there's the res cogitans, kind of thinking stuff. And my impression is that everyone from Chalmers to Kastrup to the Ions Foundation to people such as Vallee, Kreipel, Wendt, Hies, and many others, they seem to assume that they're talking about some sort of stuff or substance when they're talking about consciousness. This seems to me very philosophically naive, because if you bother to actually try to describe consciousness, you'll find a number of things. First of all, consciousness is always consciousness of something. As Brentano and Husserl remind us, consciousness is always intentional. It's always of an object. In this regard, people such as Husserl and Sartre and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and others in that field, they would insist that consciousness is nothing in itself. And this is an insight that goes back to the German idealist philosopher Fichte, who made great fun mocking a critic of Kant's, because this critic insisted on treating consciousness as a thing among other things, a stuff among other stuffs. If you describe consciousness, you see that consciousness is first and foremost a relation.
Yeah.
But these people seem more concerned with trying to find a non-physical substrate for whatever gives rise to this experience of consciousness. This seems to be the real problem, or the real question that these people are probing. They're unsatisfied with reductionist accounts, and for a good reason. But they fall into the same trap by trying to find some sort of non-physical substance or stuff that will then give rise to consciousness in living beings and perhaps even in non-living beings. I mean, there's the thesis of panpsychism that posits that there's a kind of incipient consciousness, awareness in every aspect of nature, right down to the electron. But again, this just seems to me a poor brother or a sad shadow of the sort of physicalist reduction, because you're going to end up having to meet the same problem. Well, okay, you're not going to reduce consciousness to the workings of the neurons and so on and so forth, but you're going to have to explain, well, how does consciousness arise from this other stuff, whatever it might be? And of course, it's a kind of a circular argument, and that is, well, this stuff of consciousness is defined precisely as that which gives rise to consciousness. But this is no explanation at all, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, my view of consciousness begins with a description of the experience. It begins with its intentionality. And if I'm pushed to the boards, I tend to side with Sartre and say that consciousness, compared to the res extensa, the things outside, its objects, consciousness is nothing. It is no thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very, very important first place to begin. It's probably the case that given the way we conceive of the world right now, philosophically, scientifically, there is no explanation of consciousness, kind of quote unquote, what it is, which is already a leading question. It's a metaphysical question in its very form. How it arises, we're not going to get anywhere near an answer because we're kind of deadlocked into, well, a certain set of terms, which sort of founder on the difference between the third person account, right? I put you inside a functional functional MRI machine, and I have you smell lavender, and I see that certain neurons light up. It's a third person perspective. And I associate your experience of the smell of lavender with certain responses in the nerves in your nose, and probably in your mouth, and in parts of your brain. However, it's not the case that your experience of the smell of lavender is anything like, right, the firing of neurons. The first person perspective and the third person perspective are defined by a profound gulf. And this is where the real problem is. And that's what Chalmers has referred to as the hard problem of consciousness. There are ways to dissolve this problem. One can refer to the work of Marcus Gabriel. He's a German philosopher. We might put a link to a YouTube talk that he gave recently, where he talks about this matter. And he's written a book on this as well. I Am Not a Brain. But he neither rejects the attempt to account for consciousness physically or neurologically, but he explains how the need to explain it doesn't do justice either to the human organism or to our experience of consciousness. And indeed, much of the way that we talk about it is confused. So not so much offering a solution to the problem in a more sort of Wittgensteinian way, he offers what's called he tries to dissolve aspects of the problem by showing that there's pseudo problems. One is almost tempted to send to Google, for example, a copy of a classic, a philosophical classic by Gilbert Ryle called The Concept of Mind.
Yeah.
Which of course helps, again, clear away a lot of the conceptual problems and confusions that get in the way of trying to think about this in a more clear-headed way, which is truer to the experience, which is truer to the things themselves, as Husserl would say.
Now, switching a little bit, but we'll come back to consciousness.
Okay.
What do you think of Jason Reza Jorjani's ideas about the gray aliens in his interview with Jeffrey Mishlove?
Yeah, that's a strange thing, eh? I didn't have a chance to review that interview recently, sadly. I did look up his the blurb to his book and so on. Remind me what his theses were. I seem to remember my misgivings, but if you could refresh mine and perhaps our audience's memory, that might orient the discussion a bit.
So Reza Jorjani's idea is that the gray aliens are a type of warning about the future, and that they capture the image of an imago, which is a part of a insect's development. They sort of look insectoid, the gray aliens.
Yes.
And so it's sort of like representing humanity in its development, but into something which is not necessarily good. So he warns about technology and its possible negative consequences, and that we could be heading in a direction which is, well, let's say that we lose our soul, something to that effect. And so the gray aliens are kind of representing that. And they're also capturing the insectoid image as well.
Right. This is not very original.
No, it's not.
No, not at all. And it sounds like he's moved beyond this sort of almost Jungian interpretation of the image of the alien in his latest work. Which
completely insane stuff in his latest book.
It seems pretty out there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, okay, first of all, yes, indeed, for a long time there is, and then from a most recent a book whose author eludes me right now, there's the thesis that the gray aliens are in fact time travelers from the human future, and that they are perhaps the result of genetic transhumanism gone wrong. You might look at it that way, right? Is that we've messed with our DNA, our genome to such an extent that our distant maybe even not so distant, but our distant descendants will be infertile and have to return to the past to get some pristine genetic material. And how do they appear? Well, they appear uniform, right? They're all the same color. They are indistinguishable from each other. They are apparently soulless, emotionless. They are quote unquote drones in that regard. And of course, this is an almost literary device, a kind of satire of humankind, right? As certain characteristics of precisely unfeelingness, of uniformity, and so on. As well, I mean, it's funny because you say insectoid, but if you read the earliest representations of the so-called gray aliens, like the ones we get out of the Roswell mythos, they're often referred to as almost reptilian. Their skin is reptilian, it's scaly, and they have claws. So there's that aspect as well. What's interesting also is that their size, and of course, Halpern, I think, picked up on this a little bit. He referred to them being childlike in size. And indeed, you almost want to connect them to the Jungian archetype of the child. They represent something which is potential in the future. One thing that people have done, that researchers have drawn our attention to, is how the shape of the head of the gray is very, very similar to that of a fetus. And of course, in a lot of books, you'll see, here's a picture of a gray, here's a picture of a fetus. Don't they look the same? And so they've used this to talk about, or to sort of propose an explanation for the experience along these psychological lines. So to sort of say, well, they're insectoid is, I think, to sort of pin it down too far. They're much more suggestive. There's much more variety in the descriptions of them than just the classic gray alien. And the thing is, the quote unquote classic gray alien is very much a product of the way that the UFO mythology has been commodified. The image of the gray alien is just that. It's almost a meme. If you actually look at the descriptions that people give of UFOnauts, there's a tremendous variety in size and shape and color. They tend to be, for the most part, anthropomorphic, humanoid, but not all of them. There's a wonderful story out of Japan where someone kind of encounters a sentient starfish. So you get some really wild versions of aliens out there as well. There's a wonderful fellow, Alberto Rosales, I think his name is. He's been publishing quite uncritically accounts of encounters with aliens, and the variety there is breathtaking and mind-boggling. So to sort of focus on that is a little perverse. To focus it down even more, to say, oh, they're all reptilian, forgive me, they're all insectoid is even worse. So yeah, that doesn't do justice. It just doesn't do justice either to the reported experiences, and it doesn't do justice to the experiences reported with the so-called grays. And they're much more resonant, they're much more suggestive. If we take a psychosocial stance, yeah, symbolically, there's a lot more to unpack than just sort of one particular interpretation, the way that Jorjani does there.
Yep. And by the way, the author you were thinking of, I think, is Michael Masters.
Yes.
Who's written a book about, well, he's an anthropologist, but he's given an account of how maybe the grays are from the future because of separate lines of evidence like developmental biology and other things. And certainly we wouldn't have any proof until we actually turn into grays.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read that particular book. I mean, I've gotten to the point where my library is getting a little saturated, and I'm reading more than I'm writing, which is not the best situation. You know, when I was a boy, I read a lot of comic books, among a lot of other things. And among these comic books, there are some science fiction comic books. And in one of these science fiction comic books, there was a story about an astronaut on Jupiter. And Jupiter was a wintry, cold planet. He had this little rocket ship with skis, and he was blasting along the snow banks of Jupiter. And he has an accident, and he has to leave his spaceship, and he wanders through the blizzards, and he finds this cave. And in this cave is all this machinery from the people who used to live on Jupiter. And there's a chair with this strange device above the chair, and he ends up sitting in the chair, and this device turns on a little ray, and it quote unquote evolves him. And guess what shape his evolution takes? His body decreases in size, his head increases in size, and eventually he evolves into a pure consciousness, a pure orb, and floats away. And apparently the story says that this is what happened to the people who lived on Jupiter. But you can see right there, the idea that human beings are going to, the one possible direction of human quote unquote evolution is towards this gray-like form. This is a little silly in a way. I mean, okay, masters might be able to offer some suggestions as to why it might go in that direction. But evolution doesn't have a direction. Evolution is aleatoric, if we take the Darwinian understanding. And of course, it's, especially in the UFO discourse or the New Age discourse, evolution is almost always packed with some sort of values. That I watched a TED Talk with Alex Gray, the psychedelic artist, and he adopts this pure New Age idea of evolution where there's matter and mind and spirit, and that evolution moves in a direction towards some greater intelligence, greater illumination, etc. But that ain't evolution, not from a strictly Darwinian perspective. Right? Who knows? I mean, it's the case that the human brain has actually shrunk in recent time. So yeah, I'm very, very skeptical. I don't find it very imaginative or very compelling to think in that, along that vector. Also because of my understanding of technology and its relationship to culture.
What do you think? Do you think it's like going back to Jason Reza Jorjani? Now he's obviously one of the founders of the alt-right, and he kind of disowns that now. He says that he regrets doing that, but this guy seems to turn up in the damnedest places. So like he always sort of has a cover story for what he says or does, but then you end up finding him saying things which are very in line with certain white supremacist and other very reactionary ideas. But do you find it surprising that he would write a book about, that he would even have a theory about gray aliens, let alone that he's written a book that's almost 500 pages long about UFOs, and that it talks about our civilization on Mars being destroyed?
No, I don't find that surprising at all. As we both know, there is this weird overlap between certain occult, New Age, ufological, Fortean stream of thought and reactionary, alt-right, white supremacist discourses. Why that is very interesting. This goes back at least to the turn of last century, as we both know, leading up to the Nazi regime. We also find it today, interestingly enough, in contemporary reactionary right-wing politics. You can look, for example, there is a periodical out of Italy called Libero Pensare, if I pronounce that correctly, which seems to fail to distinguish between freedom of thought from freedom from thought. But they belong to the reactionary New Age wing of Anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner's thing. And they're anti-vax, they're anti-LGBTQ, They're siding with Putin. I wonder if the periodical isn't a cat's paw, or I could say a bear's paw, for
Yeah.
but they take up all the sorts of positions that you find taken up by certain New Age people here again in the Anglosphere as well. People, sort of yoga instructors who are against vaccination, and then into this comes certain conspiracy theories around COVID, around 5G networks, now around monkeypox. And there's this whole discourse, and I don't know why this appeals so much to these people, or why it feeds into that. There's a certain irrationalism, surely, but there's not a position, there's not a political position, there's not a human philosophy, there's not a human being that doesn't have necessarily a great wad of the irrational. The rational cannot even ground itself, right? So you can't just attribute, it's not like rational good, irrational bad. Rational can be very bad. We found this during the Cold War, when Kennedy was appalled that he received a memo to the effect that, well, the United States could win a nuclear exchange with Russia. This is very, very early on. Maybe it wasn't Kennedy, maybe it was Truman, but this is very early on in the Cold War, and the American military, its cold-hearted, rational analysts crunched the numbers and said, well, you know, if there were an exchange with Russia and we were the ones to launch first, we could win.
Mm-hmm.
The president asked, well, how many people would die? Oh, you know, we'd lose like 50 million people within the first exchange. Okay, so this kind of like rationalism, right, is also deeply morally suspect. So yeah, this is a very interesting question, and it's one I'm trying to get my head around. And I have come to no satisfactory conclusions or even waypoints. But this has really been with us. This has really been with us since the end of the 19th century. This is for sure. But more than that, I mean, for example, I mean, you can point to William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet, who was also a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and involved in magic and telepathic experiments. And his book, A Vision, was channeled by his wife, George. But he also wrote marching songs for the Silver Shirts, or the Blue Shirts, forgive me, who were the Irish fascists. So it's very, 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 very difficult to plumb the depth of that and understand just what's going on and why it's going on. But no, it should come as no surprise that someone who delves into UFOs and other such things should come up with a sort of alternative history. I think this is what's important for certainly the alt-right and the white supremacists and so on, this sort of alt history. History is being a battleground, increasingly so. Right, it goes back to the notion of well, the Jews and anti-Semitism and the protocols of the elders of Zion, and of course, which is of course false. The notion of race in the ancient world, and of course there was no notion of race in the ancient world. Our notion of race is articulated in the 18th century. You know, trying to appropriate the culture of the Scandinavians, the Vikings, the ancient Germans, appropriate the culture of the Hindus, of the sort of the Indo-European culture, trying to whitewash that of the classical inheritance from Greece and Rome, all in the name of supporting and articulating and promoting white supremacist agenda. That's going on for sure. But you know, my feeling is that however much of that is going on, and however much you had the 3%ers and you had the Proud Boys at the January 6th uprising, you know, a lot of that is motivated by, you know, other concerns, which are not strictly racial, but race plays a great deal, large role as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So Jorjani, he's Iranian, is he not? I believe so.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
He talks about Persian history and its achievements, which are
Yes.
many. But he does sort of veer into racial essentialism,
Yes.
saying that that Iran should return to some sort of pure Persian blood, whatever that means, in order to get geniuses again, and that it won't get that currently.
There's a kind of eugenicism at work
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. This is most unfortunate. Um, I mean, I've got a couple of his books here. I haven't had a chance to crack them very deeply. But it's funny. I've looked at the list of books by his publisher in the back pages, and there are some really wacky titles in it there. So I
Yeah.
don't know where he's coming from. Um,
Is it published by Arctos Media?
the answer is yes.
Yeah, those guys carry, I think they're based in Hungary. I could be wrong about that, but I think they moved to Hungary, which is now obviously ruled by a populist right-wing president.
It's funny. I
Um,
look up the back, and who do I see but Alexander Dugin?
yes, exactly. I was going
Yes,
to ask you about Alexander Dugin.
yes, Alexander Dugin. And yeah, there's like, and you look at the titles, The Wasp Question, um, and things like this. It's really
And also Julius Evola.
Julius Evola, Oswald Spengler. It's funny, there's H.P. Lovecraft, there's Oswald Spengler. It's a funny mix of people. But the titles are a real dead giveaway sometimes, I tell you.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm
So,
kind of
Jorjani also goes heavily into the psychic aspect. And his thesis is that the government knows that ESP and all of that is real, and
yes,
that they're afraid of a general sort of chaos or panic, because imagine that you could just spy on your neighbor whenever you want, right? But the notion that he's trying to promote, which I don't credit at all, but the one he's trying to promote is that the government is trying to sort of keep a lid on all this stuff because it's going to be a paradigm shift, sort of like the singularity,
right.
and that the government's afraid of the consequences and of losing control, and
Right.
that in order to foster trust in society, given these new technologies and then these new paradigm shifts, you need
Yes.
an ethnically homogenous population, because only in such a population can you have enough trust.
Oh, yes.
So
Yes.
like he sort of goes around a little bit, like he doesn't say white people are better or anything, but he says things which are highly suggestive of that.
Right. Well, there are two things that come to mind there. I mean, as we know, the last century, the 20th century, was a very troubled one. And in part because of, or I would blame it mainly on the profound changes to society that occurred because of capitalism and industrialism. And this was dealt with and thought about and reflected on a great deal by artists and thinkers and so on. And if you read people such as F.R. Leavis, T.S. Eliot in his reactionary phase, W.H. Auden, I think, but I wouldn't want to credit that necessarily, but surely T.S. Eliot and his idea of a Christian society, they mourn the loss of a certain uniformity, a certain cohesiveness,
Yes.
which is cultural, which is religious, and so on, but which, as Marx pointed out, melts into air. Right? All that is solid melts into air, including carbon. And so the thing is, what you find here, you I guess with Jorjani, the way you've described him, is you do have this reactionary sentiment, right? Is that we've all been atomized, we've all been reduced to consumers. Our identities are defined by what we consume, what labels we wear, what flags we fly, as it were, what bumper stickers we have. And there's no more unity, no more cultural unity. The center does not hold, as William Butler Yeats, another great reactionary, wrote. And so this has been there's been a great deal of concerned about this, and rightly so, Now, that being said, your description of Jorjani's belief that the government knows that these phenomena are real and so on reminds me of a certain reading of the X-Files. Because especially in the early seasons of the X-Files, you get the sense that all the Fortean phenomena are in fact related in one way or the other.
Yes.
Right? It's not just aliens, but I mean, I remember a wonderful episode where there was an alien, I think it's the second or third season, where there's a shooting at a fast food restaurant and the alien heals somebody. And you start to begin to sort of say, well, yeah, it's all part of the same thing. And that's what they're trying to keep their lid on. And so it's uncanny, or perhaps a little funny, or perhaps a little worrying, how this thesis echoes a premise, or at least a possible premise, of the X-Files, for crying out loud, which speaks a lot to the prescience of the writers for that show, I think.
Yes.
But that's perhaps another matter. Yeah, I mean, look, of Jorjani's work, I've got Prometheus and Atlas here, and I've got his other book on Prometheanism, because of course I'm interested in these topics. But as I began to read the book on Prometheanism, he really struck me as a kind of a Nietzsche wannabe, as a Nietzsche one. And there's a lot of, it's very, very fluent. It's very, very fluent bluster, but it's bluster. And there's not much, substance to it. There's no thought per se. There's a thesis that he's driving at, a vision that he wants to articulate, but it's, it is, as you've observed, not without its disturbing or suspect implications.
Yeah, he seems to really venerate beauty above everything else, no matter the cost. And there's also a kind of a horseshoe theory thing going on, because he's also praised the Soviet Union.
Yes,
even though he's meant to be an alt-right type. But this is you find this as well with Alexander Dugin.
yes,
He's a national Bolshevik. At least he started as that, but now he's influenced many people in the Russian establishment. But he sort of mixes kind of traditional Russian reactionary nationalism with more left-wing sounding things. And who's the other guy?
there's Ivan Ilyin, I think it is.
I was going to say Caleb Maupin, who's an American commentator.
I don't know that name offhand.
Yeah, but he's another one of these sort of national Bolshevik types. But who's the one you mentioned?
Ivan Ilyin.
Oh, I think I've heard of him.
Yeah, because before today, I wanted to verify Alexander Dugin's name, just to make sure I remembered it and wrote it down. And I Googled Putin's philosopher.
Yes.
I heard that Dugin is referred to as Putin's philosopher, but there's another fellow, I think it's Ivan Ilyin, but I'd have to verify that.
Sounds familiar.
There are some others too. And there is this, Slavoj Zizek very famously refers to Dugin as a postmodernist, in as much as Dugin insists that, you in the West have your truth and we in the, Russia, it's not quite the East, is it? I don't know. Eurasia has its truth. And so it's a struggle of truths.
Right.
Yeah, there's a really, and I was also, there's a really strange, and I only have the faintest of acquaintance with it through, what I read here, what I read there. But there's a very strange ethno-nationalist, orthodox, religious philosophy at work in Russia.
Yeah.
Which, as you know, Putin, it has leaked into some of Putin's vocabulary, for example. It's deeply distressing. But of course, everyone forgets that Putin was in the KGB.
Yes.
So, he says a lot of things, but you've got to remember that it's probably wisest to take what he says rhetorically. That that being a KGB agent, he's the first one to understand the function of disinformation and rhetoric. And so if he comes across as a little wacko, well, that's to his advantage, right? Because it's hard to predict what a wacko wants and what a wacko is going to do. And a lot of commentators say, oh yes, he's just out of his mind. Well, no, I think he's probably all too much in his mind. And you've got to, and this is what's so dangerous about the situation, is that, what does he in fact want? I have no clue. I mean, I have clues, but I don't know. I was surprised when the Russian tanks crossed the border of Ukraine. And I've got one reading of the situation, but it's hard. Again, we're right in the middle of things, and the fog of war distorts everything. And there's no source of information which doesn't have spin put on it. So it's very, very hard to suss out what's going on. But that's the nature of history, right? As history unfolds, it seems chaotic and aleatoric, and it's only in retrospect that we can make sense of it and its necessities appear.
Yeah.
And that's what's at stake in this struggle for history, right? What, in fact, are our origins? Are white people a race, a species different from others? Which is, of course, a really wacky idea. Where does civilization come from? And so on and so forth. And that's why I think a lot of people put so much effort into, trying to make claims about the past and claim the past, usually for sentimental reasons, but these sentimental reasons have a rhetorical power as well, right? That, oh yes, the founders of Western civilization were all white men, right? That idea serves a certain way of looking at the world. It's not exactly true. It's a lot more complicated.
Yes.
So that's the point. That's the point. And any classicist will be the first to tell you that. So.
And Putin apparently may be influenced by something called cosmism. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, I read up on. I had heard of cosmism, and cosmism interested me about a year or so ago. I wanted to look into that because of the way that it fetishizes or otherwise valorizes so-called advance and technology. But of course, it's much more than that. And of course, it also has a number of different proponents, all of whom put their own inflection on this idea. But it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's forward-looking. And you've got to remember, culturally, at the turn of last century, between the 1900s and the 20th century, there was a lot of looking forward to the future. There was still a belief in progress, right? That as industrialization went forward, as science advanced, things would materially and socially and culturally get better. This, of course, came to a crashing halt in the trenches of the First War for most people. And it certainly vaporized and disappeared up the smokestacks at Auschwitz and Hiroshima for the rest of us, I would like to think. But cosmism is certainly part of this optimism. What's interesting about it is the way that it tries to conceive of the human being, and correctly in its own weird way, as being part of the cosmos. Not just an earthling, right? But the Earth is part of a larger system. The Earth is no more sealed off from what's off the Earth than the human body is sealed off from all the other organisms around it. One of the points that posthumanism makes is that the human body isn't sort of one thing. It's actually very, very many things, from the microbiome to the biome that is on your skin, all the organisms that actually live on and in the body that are necessary to the body functioning properly and healthily, all the way down into the genome, where you find genes and other genetic material that come from viruses and other things, which are part and parcel of the human being. So you can't even portion off the human being as sort of one thing among other things. No, it's also kind of a continuum in a way. And cosmism sort of grasps this. I recently read a wonderful paper by a great, interesting scholar here in Canada, Joshua Schuster at Western University. And he's in the English department, but he wrote a wonderful paper on SETI. And he introduced me to something called critical habitability studies, which is an interdisciplinary approach to dealing with questions of the habitability of the Earth, and of course, the habitability of other planets and other environments. And he, in the course of this paper, posits an interplanetary humanism, right? Which echoes quite interesting with certain sentiments of cosmism. Now, of course, with cosmism, as I read in certain of its articulations, there are certain kind of imperialist notions that the human race should take its rightful place in the universe and sort of colonize everywhere. Maybe a forerunner of Dune, I don't know. Also, not just human beings, but the best of human beings. There's a kind of a eugenics at work in some of it as well. And this you hear echoed in some speeches by Putin. There's a particular term in Russian that eludes me right now, because I never studied Russian, and so I don't have the neurons to catch hold of it, although oshtonenia and glasnost, they stick in my brain. Yeah, this is very, very interesting. But again, there's an interesting melange of influences in Putin's speeches, right? There's Dugin and company, and this kind of Russia as holding spiritual values, moral values, this kind of his recent pronouncements or his recent calling back to Peter the Great, which of course strikes a terrible chill into people of Western Europe. Very, very interesting. But cosmism as such, I haven't had a chance to really delve into it at all. I've had the most passing of acquaintances with it. My initial interest was the way that it valorized technology and progress, but the second scratch I made out of it revealed these more disturbing elements, which of course it shares with other movements.
Yes.
So,
you mentioned anthroposophy.
Yes.
But just to be fair to anthroposophy, I mean, there are reactionary streams within it, but there's also more progressive streams, right?
Yes, I wanted to say this. I know I sort of got off on this one organ in Italy, but yes, you're perfectly correct. There is this very reactionary, racist, anti-vax, religious stream, absolutely. But there are, and I say this because I have a very good friend of mine whose children attend a Waldorf school, and they are he's a communist. Okay, and the people at this Waldorf school are, they pick up the progressive, experimental, humane dimensions of Steiner's teachings. So yeah, I had wanted to get around to that to balance my condemnation of its more reactionary, distasteful side. But you're absolutely right, and this is the other thing. It's hard to tar any group with the same brush. There are some groups that should be tarred, yes, and feathered and driven out of town. There's no doubt. But one has to be careful and respectful for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, please go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna switch tracks a little.
Yes.
But what are the mechanisms by which outright fiction can enter into outright belief? So, we talked about the real belief, from Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race,
Yes.
and how that's been, literally is now believed by some people to be real.
Yes.
Do you think one of the mechanisms that fiction can sort of infuse itself into belief is that there's a sort of underlying symbolic reality which is being expressed by the fictional story, but it becomes iconic in the mind, and so it can sort of burrow into it and then re-emerge? Is that one mechanism?
No.
Oh.
No, I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think so. I mean, one can approach it in a slightly more simple way. Keep in mind, okay, let's put it this way. In French, the word for history is histoire, and the word for story is histoire. In German, the word for history is Geschichte, and the word for story is Geschichte. And in the 18th century, you would have novels with the title, The True History of. Right? So we used to have that conflation in English as well. So how does, what's one way that fiction can be taken to be truth? Well, it happens at the level of language, and it happens at the level of narration. There was a great conflict in the 1980s, primarily during the theory wars, that was sparked by the works of the historiographer Hayden White. And he made the point rather rigorously that historians, when they write their books, use the same rhetorical devices as a novelist does in writing his or her or their true fictional histories. So at a certain level, at the linguistic level, at the rhetorical level, there's a very simple, it's easy for, you can't distinguish whether something is telling the truth or not telling the truth. Or that their truths are different. Their truths are different. There's a truth to fiction and there's a truth to history. And so the moment you have any narration, the moment they have narration, the possibility of this elision is opened up. Secondly, this happens over time. One could, and I wouldn't be the first, argue that we could have the Christian religion as we have it today, quite apart from the factual existence of a human being called Jesus who wandered around saying things. All that's important is that a certain story made the rounds and was taken up in a certain way. We know as well, for example, that, let me back that up a little bit. I saw a wonderful meme by a Protestant theologian. And in this meme, he makes the point, I wish I had it on my wall so I could quote it, but he makes the point that it's not that ancient peoples were naive and they told stories that they took literally that then we understand symbolically. It's quite the opposite. They were smart enough to write symbolic stories that we then take literally, right? And so you find this, so how is it the case that a certain portion of the American population believes that the earth is 6,000 years old?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, if we can answer that question, we could answer the question you pose. So it's not just the case it's happening linguistically. It's not just the case it's happening over time, right? Because if I'm raised by certain people who take certain narratives to be factual truth, then I will take them as factual truth. I may come to renege on that, as some people do, but it's also the case that, and this goes back to your proposal, that there's something about these stories. Not any story is going to be taken up as true later. There has to be something timely and compelling about it. It has to touch on a concern, absolutely, right? But I would be very hesitant to, go further and talk about some pool of symbolic, I mean, along Jungian lines that, oh, well, the stories that touch on the archetypes are the ones that will later be taken to be true, right? And this is why some Christians, some Catholics are very fervent believers in the Virgin Mary and her intercessions, right? No, I don't. I think that's going too far. I think there are more sort of down to earth or other ways of accounting for this phenomenon, which is undoubtedly the case. It undoubtedly occurs, but you can assume a lot less. Just pointing to the way that the way that culture occurs over time, and the way that narrative operates in different genres.
And what do you think of the ideas of Erich Fromm, the Swiss psychoanalyst?
Oh, I wouldn't begin. I'm very, I have no good acquaintance with the work of Erich Fromm, sadly.
Okay.
Fromm is interesting from the little bit I know about him. I was surprised to learn that he was for a while associated with the Frankfurt School, worked with them. But more than that, I can't say, sadly. There are a number of a lot of very interesting people in the psychoanalytic school. I mean, I've got most of Freud's work here on the bookshelf. I've got lots of Jung. My Wilhelm Reich library is growing, and I've got some Lacan. Not that I understand Lacan at all, and I wonder if anyone really does, which I think is kind of the way he writes. But anyway, that's another thing. But there's Fromm, there's Geza Roheim. I've got one of his books here. There are, a number of other people. There's a wonderful movement of the 20th century, but yeah, well, I'm sad to say Fromm Fromm falls outside of my ken. What do you find about his writings interesting or compelling?
I guess the most interesting idea that I've encountered in him, specifically in his book, The Sane Society, which I
Mhm.
think was written in mid 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. And it was offered as a sort of critique of contemporary American society, which Erich Fromm saw as like the most advanced and progressive society, but still with many problems. But
Yes,
one of the things that he mentioned is that sometimes humans, they turn their own creations into objects of veneration. And
yes,
then they bestow them with a sort of power that they had hitherto been attributed to human beings. So, for
yes,
example, God, right, is bestowed with a power of all knowledge. And
yes,
so we sort of hold him up as like the source of all knowledge, even though he's ultimately a creation of the human mind and human culture. And
yes,
you find other things like which are sort of reified, like is that the right word? Reified, when you turn something into a thing.
yes, it is.
Mhm. So like this, the market,
The
we
market,
sort of
yes,
we think of it as a thing in itself, right? Which
yes,
has got its own will. Or we
mhm,
think about, the need to always serve economic growth. It's always assumed that growth is good.
yes,
And so do you think something like that could be going on with UFOs? That we
yes,
sort of attribute like a kind of higher power to them?
oh,
Even
yes, yes, yes. Look, this is some. There's another word for this. It comes out of anthropology. It's called fetishism,
yes.
right? When I take something I make and then suddenly I kind of forget that I made it and it takes on a power or a being of its own that I then subject myself to. That's fetishism. Oh, good Lord, yes, 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 yes. Um, Two good examples. I mean, the most recent example is this Google engineer who believes that the software he's been working on has become sentient. Talk
Hmm.
about an example of reification of fetishism. And this was pointed out by a professor of linguistics in The Guardian. He said, well, listen, tell Surprise that this engineer who's been working for years on developing and perfecting and honing the software that's designed to fool us into thinking that it's a person talking to us, should be, fooled by his own creation. Um, it's funny. Um, this term reification, I mean, that's an important one for me because it also relates to ideology, and the worship of the market is precisely this. That's part of the ideology of neoliberalism,
Yeah.
right? Those ideas, which are in fact cultural and in fact serve only a portion of society, are posited to be natural and part of the very nature of the universe. And every society does that. The ruling class of every society does that because it wants to reproduce the social order that gives it its privilege and wealth. So that, when it comes to Marxist ideology critique, this notion of reification is highly functional and very illuminating often. So when it comes to UFOs, I mean, yes, the argument that motivates almost every sentence of what I write at Skunkworks is that the UFO, conceived of or understood or imagined to be some form of quote unquote advanced technology, is precisely a fetishization or reification of the ruling ideology of so-called advanced societies. This is why we call them technocratic. Every problem is a problem of means to ends. Every problem has got to be resolved in the most quote unquote efficient manner possible. All too often, that efficiency is defined in terms of profitability. Jean-Francois Lyotard, in his own way, pegs this as the quote unquote postmodern condition, this sort of technocratic and unquestioned technocratic approach to social matters. This is why our elections in the so-called developed or so-called first world tend to be choose your management team, right? I mean, so here in Canada, it's do you want this management team? Do you want the orange management team? Do you want the blue management team? Or do you want the red management team? And the question is, well, I don't want a management team. I want to raise questions how we want to live together. and how we might continue to live together and what's important, right? So when it comes to UFOs, this is precisely it. Yes, the moment we imagine them to be technological artifacts, more quote unquote advanced than our own, all we're doing is projecting the kind of thing we do and imagining them more powerful, more fast, etc., than they in fact are, and lending a reality to something which is simply a projection of, to put it too strongly, an accident of our own cultural societal moment.
Mhm.
So yes, most vehemently yes.
And connected to that, the idea that UFOs might be a sort of, and Vallee has sort of touched upon this with his notions that UFOs have got a symbolic meaning and they're trying to communicate some meaning to us in a kind of seemingly nonsensical way, but that underneath that is, or through that is encoded a kind of deeper meaning.
Yes.
And which could be, there could be environmental messages or existential messages about the dangers of nuclear warfare embedded into that. But do you think that it might be possible that we're kind of using the UFO as a way to warn ourselves? Because, you know, people can talk and talk and they never reach consensus, but maybe by presenting an image of an outside intelligence, it becomes more compelling to us, certain problems in society. And so then we might pay more attention to them.
Well, this is a very, very, very complex question. And it's actually one I've been giving some thought to the past few days, but I haven't had a chance to articulate the thoughts in writing yet. Because recently an acquaintance of mine shared a meme which quotes a passage from Vallee's very famous, and I think rightly so, paper on the 5 arguments against the extraterrestrial origin of UFOs. And he remarks in this passage that of his own control system hypothesis, and there are 2 addenda to that, or 2 variations on the control system hypothesis. And one is that we're dealing with a kind of planetary intelligence, either another race or another sort of quote-unquote consciousness, which might be similar to that posited by the Gaia hypothesis. One. And the other is, again, along your lines and along Jung's lines, or as you just outlined, that we're dealing something more with like a collective unconscious, and it has to do with environmental concerns. There are a number of problems there. First of all, I like, if we follow Vallee as far as accepting at face value the experiences that he collates in works like Passport to Magonia and others, that lead him to this hypothesis that the apparent absurdity, the physically paradoxical nature of the UFO as a quote unquote object, the kinds of experiences that are reported with the occupants and so on, that these are constitute quote unquote a kind of meta logic or meta language.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, we have to assume that this body of events, we have to give him that. We have to begin there. And then given these events and their features, I think it's a fruitful way of accounting for their paradoxality and their absurdity and their nonsensical nature. And I've touched on this at Skunkworks blog, quoting Roland Barthes, who wrote a couple of books called Mythologie, and he actually writes a short work on the flying saucer. It's not a very insightful article, but at least he addresses the matter in the 1950s in France. But he uses the example that he's in Latin class in the Lycée, and he reads a sentence in Latin, something to the effect that the name of how does it go? Something the name of the lion is Leo. Well, this sentence is not about lions. This is an example of a certain way that Latin grammar works, that the verb always agrees with its subject, right? So the meaning of the sentence is not the meaning of the sentence. The significance of the sentence is not what it means, if you follow what I'm saying, right? The sentence means, my name is Leo, when you translate into English. But the significance of the sentence is that the verb always agrees with the subject, right? I got into a little threaded, snarled Facebook thread the other day, and people were, it was about a sentence from Adorno. And Adorno makes among other things, he says that animals neither laugh nor cry. And there was a lot of talking about, well, do animals cry? Luckily, my wife is German, and I asked her, well, if I say, die Tiere weinen nicht, animals don't cry in German, am I saying something about animals, or am I just giving an example of the usage of those terms in German? And the answer is the latter, okay? You would never say of an animal that it cries in German, because you don't use that word to talk about the sounds that an animal in pain, whether emotional or physical, makes. So it's the same sort of thing there. So what we have here is that the UFOs are not what they appear to be. This is Vallee's essential thesis, right? They appear to be visitors from outer space, collecting samples, abducting animals, abducting people, playing cat and mouse with our air forces, surveying the planet, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But the closer we look at that, we realize that's not what's going on at all, for various reasons that he gives us. So the thing is, okay, so the meaning, right, what they appear to be, is not their significance. Good. So far, so good. But that then requires what I've posited as first of all, we have to develop a semiotic, if not a hermeneutic. And what I mean is that first of all, we need if we're being communicated to, quote unquote, symbolically, we need to sort of develop a sense of the grammar of what's being said. And grammar is distinct from semantics. Grammar is just, okay, what are the sentences? And then the semantics, or the hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, gets us to the meaning of that sentence. Before you can understand that kein Tieren weinen, you've got to understand, well, wait a minute, what's the grammar of that sentence? What's the subject? What's the verb? What's the modifier, and so on? And only then can you make sense of the words themselves. So that's why first of all, you need a semiotic or a linguistics. And second of all, and only then can you get towards a hermeneutics or an interpretation of what's going on. And these are two steps that people have a hard time taking. But that's, of course, what we're doing. And that's, of course, what I'm doing at Skunkworks blog. So if we venture some sort of attempt at interpreting, okay, what the UFO, either as a phenomenon in itself, right, as something which has a being independent, it's an attempt to communicate to us, or if it's a projection from some other. So that other, big O other, could be the collective unconscious, which is an other, because it's not within consciousness, it's not within our powers. Or it could be something outside of us, in which case it is, again, a quote unquote other, like the beautiful linden tree that sits outside my study window. Is it trying to give us, is it trying to steer us clear of environmental disaster? Yes and no. How yes? Well, at face value, those creatures who communicate to George Adamski and other contactees warn him away from atomic warfare and atomic weapons and developing nuclear energy. Of course, he steals this idea from the day the Earth stood still. Mm-hmm. Many abductees and many people who encounter things, such as some of the children at the Ariel incident, refer to being given information by telepathic messages from the aliens that, okay, you've got to take better care of your planet. Yes, but yes. Notice that's the meaning, that's not the significance. You follow? That's happening within what it appears to be. It appears to be that these aliens are coming from other countries and trying to help us save ourselves, right? Which is of the same order as UFOs or spaceships from other planets, and the ufonauts or astronauts taking samples, right, of water, of earth, of plants, of animals, of human beings, conducting experiments, conducting observations. It's of that same order. So that's not the symbolic significance, right? That's not the significance. That's just the meaning, right? So what then is the significance? And my thesis has been that the significance is, it is in a certain sense, what it does is it presents to us the hope that the problems that technological development have gifted us will themselves be solved technologically.
Mhm.
That, however, is very dangerous for two reasons. A, it is ideological. All it does is it just re-entrenches the system that gives immense power to people like Elon Musk.
Yes.
I don't know, recently in Physord, which is a website, a science site I follow, a number of scientists have been quite concerned about the pollution that's caused by space tourism. And it's quite substantial. It's quite substantial, and it has to be mitigated and has to be controlled. But try telling Elon that, right?
Yeah.
So at the same time, not only is it fetishistic, yes, and this is the other thing, is it neglects how technology in fact operates. I may have, and probably did share this anecdote last time, that when I teach an introduction to a college English course at the school where I teach, sometimes I'll give a little article about how we're at the risk of losing a great deal of our contemporary history because it's stored on different medium and in different media, forgive me, and in different software that quickly become obsolete. And so you may know, for example, that a lot of the very earliest data of the SETI program is stored on magnetic tapes, which are at danger of being lost because we're losing the machinery to read them and the software to read them.
Yeah.
And so inevitably a question comes up, well, you know, why does technology change? Why does software change? And invariably, a well-meaning student will put up his or her hand and say, well, it's just progress, sir. Right? As if it's just a natural state of affairs that technology changes in a certain way. All right? So the thing is that technology does not change in and of itself in the same way that the equinoxes have a precession. And I say, no, so-and-so, you know why technology changes? Investment. That's why technology changes. Okay? Yeah. And so the thing is that if we're going to solve the kinds of problems that face us socially, environmentally, it's not going to happen exclusively through technology. Technology will have human ingenuity will have a role to play. If there's going to be a new Green Deal, we have to develop, better solar cells, better power systems, so on and so forth. But the most important dimension to any change that's going to do the trick is social.
Yes.
Social change is needed. And that can't be done technocratically, and it can't be done technologically. And that's what's missing. That's the danger. So the thing is that the flying saucer is an image that appears on a horizon at a moment of extreme existential crisis. It holds out promise, but I think that promise is a false promise. And that's its danger. Or that's the danger of how its meaning is interpreted by and large. That's very important. Ironically, Vallee also brings up in Revelations the fact that a lot of the beings that communicate to people, such as Rael, such as Billy Meyer, and other contactees who come from strange planets, they always have the same kind of name, Umo, Effa, and so on. They come from these weirdly uniform, totalitarian societies.
Yes.
Intolerant societies. And so he wonders, well, is someone trying to, place these seeds in our mind that, well, that the utopian society is ultimately a kind of ethnically uniform, socially, culturally uniform society. It's funny that idea sort of seems to have gone away. He seems to have abandoned that idea or let that idea lie fallow. So as I did remark last time, I know my concern with the whole UFO mythology is the way that it just entrenches existing power structures and gives us false hope. You find this in someone like Stephen Greer, for example, who's all up in arms about the suppressed technology. And he's not the only one. And he's of the opinion that, oh, well, if the technology that has been recovered and back engineered by the American and other governments were set free, then we would have a utopia. Well, no, that technology would be immediately monopolized by the powers that be, and you would still have to pay for it, and it wouldn't be shared equitably. It's funny, this is also part of the plot line of a recent remake of The Man Who Fell to Earth, a very well written and well acted series on HBO. But there, an alien comes from a desert planet, and he's come to give us nuclear fusion. And sure enough, there's a CIA agent who's intent on getting the plans and suppressing the release of the technology and monopolizing it, even if that means the death of all life on Earth.
Yeah.
So this is where I'm at with things. In that vein, I was very happy to recently get the book I Want to Believe by Gitlitz is the author's name. And it is a study of the only overtly communist sort of UFO group, right? The Positists.
Yes.
The Positists, they're weird kind of South American Trotskyists. They also suffer from a techno fetishism, I would argue. That, but of course, the flying saucers are from communist planets, because only communist planets give the social conditions for the kinds of technological advance that would result in flying saucers. That was the kind of thinking that went on among them. I haven't had a chance to get to that either. I've been a very busy bee in a lot of other directions here. What am I paying all these unpaid interns for? Why aren't they reading these books and writing me reports? So I got to get around to that. But yeah, techno-fetishism, man, that's the problem. And that's why I've got these two books by Jorjani on Prometheanism, go figure. Because Prometheus, of course, is the god who gave us, quote unquote, fire and quote unquote technology.
Yeah. And by the way, Adamski was apparently, and so were other contactees back in the 50s and 60s that were investigated by the FBI, some of them, because of suspected communist sympathies, because they were saying some things about the alien societies which sounded very communistic.
Yes, yeah, there's that too. The contactees are a very interesting bunch. Of course, there's Adamski, he's the first, I'm pretty sure, but there's Daniel Fry, right, the White Sands incident, Howard Menger, who seems much more innocent, Orfeo Angelucci, whom Jung writes about, and many, many others. But yes, you're perfectly correct on that. And I think Nick, what's his name? Why is it eluding me there? He's a very prolific writer on Fortean matters and the UFOs. Yeah, Nicholas Redfern. I think he's actually, I've got his book on the contactees here, but he's recently written, and maybe there's another book of his. He's very, very prolific, very, very hardworking man. That he has another book that investigates and probes the way that the FBI looked into the early contactees, because they thought it was a Russian psyop.
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't put it beyond them.
Right.
They're very cunning,
Well, that sort of leads on to the next question, which is about capitalism.
Yes.
So what do you think is the role of the UFO within capitalism specifically? Like, do you think that it's got more of a role in a capitalist society than, say, a socialist society? Or is it more about the technology, which, could be shared between those two societies? Because there was UFO interest in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
But I'm not entirely up to date about how prolific it was versus the US.
Oh, I think it was very lively. This is the impression I have. It's just a lot of the work, a lot of that investigation was samizdat, and a lot of it translated, and a lot of it. I mean, Vallee writes a book about this. He went to I think it was post-Glasnost Soviet Union, and did some research. I've got a book here, UFOs Behind the Iron Curtain, as well. So there was a lot of interest, and indeed, the first book on SETI was a translation and collaboration with
Hmm.
Copenhagen, and I think the guy's name is Shklovsky, but I'd have to look it up. I would say, well, okay, this brings us to very profound historical reflections. My thesis, or my stance, how's that? My stance would be that we wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution the way that we had it without capitalism. Indeed, you could even make an argument we wouldn't have had the scientific revolution the way we've had it without capitalism, because as you know, it's around the time that capitalism is just beginning to develop in England. And I'm of the school that says that capitalism is not mere mercantilism. Capitalism is not mere trade. It's a very specific social formation that you can trace back very clearly to agricultural reforms in 17th century England.
Yeah.
You see its effects even in the plays of Shakespeare. Okay, so these changes led to changes in thought and changes in society, which arguably even underwrote the possibility for Newton to think the way he did about space. Okay, that again, that's not an argument unique to me. And so these changes in agriculture, and then the changes in industry, especially spinning in England, you can make an argument that it was because of the capitalist organization of that industry that led to the exploitation of fossil fuels rather than water power. This is the argument made by Andreas Malm in his great book, Fossil Capital. And so if the scientific revolution, as we know it in Europe, and the industrial revolution, as we know it, comes out of the matrix of capitalism, right? Then there is something very essentially capitalist, but about the UFO as a technological artifact. Now, of course, the Soviet Union as well, and so-called real existing socialisms, also had the technology and industry and so on and so forth, but that was because they're post-capitalist societies, and they had to compete with capitalist societies, right? So the thing is that there's something essentially that in fact, from the point of view of now, right, where history takes on its necessities or its apparent necessities, capitalism is the cradle of science and technology as we know it. And therefore, if that's the case, the UFO emerges within that broader cultural matrix, especially when it's understood to be or conceived to be or perceived to be an example of quote unquote advanced technology.
Right.
Okay. Now, of course, that's a position that requires a great deal of elaboration. You've got to talk about technology. What is technology? How do I understand technology? This and that. And it's not airtight at all, but that's kind of how I see things right at the moment. I mean, I also borrow from Martin Heidegger's approach or reading of technology as a way of framing phenomena. Or in his work on technology in the 50s, I think it is. But you've got to be very careful with invoking the name of Martin Heidegger. He was, as one of his students told me, a brilliant philosopher, but a stupid politician. As we know, very along with a lot of other people, mind you, who should have known better and eventually did know better. Supporter of the Nazi regime, unrepentant about that support. But again, his Nazism was one that none of the higher ups wanted anything to do with. They thought he was a total weirdo. And so my point in that regard, again, but a very, very deeply complicated question, and not in any way to exculpate the stupidity of this support, is that Heidegger's Nazism was like Ezra Pound's fascism, a very, very idiosyncratic and much more cultural and philosophical than imperialistic and murderous, as these regimes turned out to be. So, but to go back, whoop, yeah, capitalism is the matrix of science and technology, and that's the possible horizon of the appearance of the UFO as it's perceived in the 20th century or 19th century, right? With the so-called airships.
Yeah, right.
If indeed any airships were in fact seen,
Mm-hmm.
right? Very much, I'm always leaning more and more to it was just a very elaborate hoax by the newspapers to garner subscribers and buyers and profits. But again, that goes back to an earlier question. I mean, how does fiction become fact? Well, there you go, right? It may very well have been the case that a number of, and we know for sure that a lot of these stories were just made up. But you can also imagine how, someone reads a story in the newspaper, takes it at face value, and then before you know it, they're looking at something they can't quite understand in the sky, and it's an airship. Right? That's again part of the psychosocial hypothesis.
Yes. The other aspect of maybe somebody could do a comparative study of ufology within socialist countries versus capitalist countries, is that in capitalism you've got mechanisms of commodification that are not always present in socialism.
Yes.
So, ufology in the US is highly profit driven. There's all books and magazines and so on, movies about UFOs. So I wonder if there's more variety or some other parameter which we could study.
That's a very, very interesting question. You see, the thing is, like, what are we going to define as a socialist country? I imagine we would think of post 1921 USSR, and then post World War II Eastern Bloc. So, and then this would also include China at a certain moment, North Korea at a certain moment, North Vietnam at a certain moment, Cuba.
Yeah.
But these are all places where we would have, quote unquote, really existing socialism. Yeah, that'd be a very interesting study. I'm not too sure what it would turn up, because the other thing, you see, what's interesting too is that I'm not the kind of reductive Marxist that wants to explain everything in terms of the processes of production and the relations of production, because there's culture too. There's language, there are cultural traditions, and although they happen within an economic context, people have to be fed, watered, clothed, educated. Right? The human body has got to be looked after before it's going to look up at the stars. It's a very, very interesting, complex cultural, sociological question. Yeah, that'd be a great study. There's the theme has vista, man. The theme has vista, and there are more and more people happily now being able to pursue it in their doctoral studies.
Yes.
So great. There's something for somebody to do.
Now, capitalism relates to the Enlightenment. So what do you think are the strengths of the Enlightenment and its weaknesses? And do you think that we need something like a second Enlightenment? And what would it address? Like, what sort of issues would it need to address? And do you think that the Enlightenment speaks to a true universality or a false one, as its critics have claimed?
I think the Enlightenment aspires to a true universality. There are, you can criticize it, and it has been criticized, and some of these criticisms are pertinent. Not all of them. One thing you've got to remember about the Age of Reason is what preceded it. And that was the god-awful slaughter and conflict of the Reformation. The 30 Years' War kept Germany in the Middle Ages until the 18th century. So god-awful was the slaughter that occurred in that country. And you wonder why, after such religious enthusiasm, people suddenly say, well, let's try to be more reasonable. Let's try to find common ground, right? Yeah. So this is often forgotten. Some people seem to think that I don't know, history proceeds because someone has an idea somewhere. No, the history proceeds along lines of what came before. So along these lines, I think we will have a sort of an Enlightenment moment, a rationalist moment, in depending how many of us survive the present moment of increasing irrationality, right? The increasing polarization and disruption of any notion of universal reason. So the Enlightenment in its best aspects, those that have been articulated by someone like Jürgen Habermas, and even, you know, ironically, one can read Jacques Derrida as an Enlightenment figure, because an essential aspect of Enlightenment is sapere aude, as Kant reminds us, think for yourself. The critical element is essential to Enlightenment. That's why we talked earlier about the Greek Enlightenment with Socrates and Plato, because it criticized the traditional ways that things were understood that came before, that were essentially religious and mythological. Using reason, using what they called at the time dialectic, talking things through by reason rather than appealing to Homer or Hesiod or an oracle or what have you. Increasingly, in a plural world, it becomes imperative to find common ground and a common language. This is where the best impulses of the Enlightenment are essential, because that is the drive. It doesn't posit necessarily a universal reason as the way that upper class British men thought in the pub or in the coffee house in 1782. That's a parody. If you read Kant, he has his limitations. If you read the people who follow, if you read Habermas and others, the drive is to a greater reason. But what is reason? That itself is up for grabs. That itself is in process. That itself has got to be figured out. The promise lies in the fact that wherever you have disagreement, you must have common ground, or there's no place for the disagreement to occur. This is an essential hermeneutic insight. So even though you might have if you're going to have, again, to use an all too timely example, if you're going to have two armies fight it out, you've got to have them fight it out in the same space. There's something they share, right? And so at the level of disagreement, okay, there's always the possibility of uncovering these shared assumptions, bringing them to light, and trying to come to a greater, quote unquote, rational agreement. Why this has broken down, why this goodwill has broken down, is itself an interesting question. But there's very, very much an important need for enlightenment. I don't think that the criticisms of the so-called postmodernists, people like Jean-François Lyotard, with his notions of postmodernity, the differend, and others, those don't hold water, as far as I'm concerned. But the task of the Enlightenment is one that is the project of enlightenment is far from finished, and it's one that is increasingly urgent the more polarized and fractious things become. That being said, keep in mind that it was also Jürgen Habermas who coined the expression the post-secular. So a lot of people parody the Enlightenment by comparing it to the culture of Vulcan on Star Trek, where everyone is logical and rational and everything is solved by reason. That's not the Enlightenment. And even if it were, it's not sufficient. Reason can neither ground itself, nor can it answer all the questions that human beings face, especially those that have to do with moral conduct. This is why all societies have to fall back on their religious traditions and other traditions for moral orientation. What is good behavior? What is bad behavior? What is good? What is evil? Reason cannot answer that question. And this is why we have what Habermas called the post-secular, and it's articulated as well by people such as Charles Taylor, who wrote the book on secularism, Judith Butler, Cornel West, wonderful thinker, to sort of point out the fact that at one point, it was thought by sociologists of religion that as science and reason advance, religions will wither away and die and disappear. This, of course, has not happened. Why is that? And the answer is Habermas and others, and actually before them all, the great Canadian poet and scholar Peter Dale Scott had already articulated this insight. Societies, for their moral orientation, need to rely on tradition and religion and resources other than reason. Reason, again, plays a role when it comes to trying to negotiate how different beliefs might coexist fruitfully and peacefully in a secular society, which is a very, very pertinent problem where I'm speaking to you from here in Quebec, where a law was passed recently which forbids the overt wearing of a religious symbol, be it a crucifix, a kippah, a turban, or a hijab, by anyone in the civil service, because the society is supposedly secular. I'm also in a city where there's a big cross on the top of the highest mountain in the middle of the city, and the name of every street begins with Saint. Okay, but this is so the Enlightenment is not sufficient, but it's necessary. How's that? Yeah.
So you wouldn't I'm guessing credit Sam Harris's notion that there could be a science of morality.
No, not at all.
But do you think that science could nevertheless inform our decisions about morality?
No.
In any way? Like
yes. Okay. Look, it's not. We can't. We wouldn't want to do it. I mean, how to put it? We have games. What a terrible time for examples, right? You just had the Roe versus Wade being eliminated in overturned in the United States, and some of the debate. Let's put it this way: some of the debate around the morality of abortion orbits the question of, well, at what point should we consider the fetus a person? Okay. Surely, if we're going to countenance that question, and I underline that then science might very well have something to say, right? At what point is the fetus viable? At what point is there a brainwave? Is that what we're going to count as a person? And so on and so forth. So of course science has something to say because it tells us facts about the world. And our moral decisions happen within a context of facts and how we understand those facts. Right? But the thing is that a lot of psychology or neurology and so on, or evolutionary psychology, they don't so much help us with moral questions. They try to explain why and how human beings have this moral sense. And that doesn't do justice to the real problem that the human being has in negotiating a world of the duties and inclinations, to put it in Kantian terms.
Yes.
Right? I mean, if you look at it from a purely physicalist point of view, most people will say that there's no such thing as free will. Well, that kind of snuffs out the very question of morality to begin with, because if there's no free will, then I'm not responsible for what I do. Of course, there is free will. Each of us knows this, and we have a decision to make. The more crisis-ridden that decision is. The very cornerstone of the Kantian critical philosophy is the positing of human freedom, which is why it was so important, and it occurred at the time of the French Revolution, right? So yes, of course, science has something to say. The different sciences have something to say. It might help us understand why we have certain prejudices the way we do, why we're inclined to make decisions in some ways rather than others. It also helps us understand why we are often essentially moral human beings, and why the notion that society is in fact not a war of all against all is why we have mirror neurons, and why we are empathetic, and why human beings are gregarious creatures, and how that works. right? So yes, of course it plays into it, but there'll never be a quote unquote science of morality. No, no. That's a much more complex question.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, does environmental science try to, well, it obviously tries to grapple with how nature works and how we interact with it.
Mhm.
But do you think that it tries to quantify and control something that is inherently unquantifiable and uncontrollable?
Well, this is the really terrible irony of our situation. Um, for a long time, for a long time, certain human societies, not all, but surely the society within which I live, has liked to think that it could sort of dominate nature.
Yes.
Got to keep in mind that beauty as we know it, nature as being beautiful, nature as being sublimely beautiful, that only occurs in the 18th century because we had begun to dominate nature to a certain extent and it was no more terrifying, right?
Mhm.
You read Dante and he finds himself in a dark wood at the beginning of the Divine Comedy. And the terror that the pilgrim feels in the dark wood is something that we simply cannot empathize with, most of us, because that nature as being completely out of our control has disappeared. Now, the irony is that, well, part of the problem, one reason we've run so afoul is because we thought that we could just use nature instrumentally, dominate it, quote unquote, manage it. But
Yeah.
we have found ourselves now in a state, well, what we're the only way out of the crisis that we find ourselves in is to manage it, but better.
Mhm.
Okay, to work with it in a much more egalitarian form. So and I'm not the first one to make that point. So the environmental sciences, I think any ecologist, any environmental scientist is the first to agree with you that yes, what we're dealing with here is a nonlinear system which is out of control. That is its nature, if you will. As I said, the Earth itself is not a closed system. Stuff enters the atmosphere all the time. Indeed, sunlight and solar radiation enters the atmosphere all the time, or there wouldn't be life on Earth. And likewise, stuff leaves the atmosphere too. And so the question is but again, notice it's a social question. How can we live in a way that is quote unquote sustainable? And that is almost an impossible question to answer now because we're no longer living in the Holocene. This is something I've been working on creatively in part. That the Holocene is, of course, that climactic period that follows the Ice Age. So it's about the past 10,000 years. And it is characterized by a great deal of stability and temperateness. And it was that friendly, predictable matrix that allowed for the possibility of agriculture, and from agriculture, division of labor and civilization and society as we know it. Well, we've left that planet. We're already colonizing another planet. Okay, it's what an environmental activist has called EAARTH, Earth. Okay, it's a new planet because we're living now in a climate which the Earth has not known for, I think, around 2.5 million years. I could be wrong on that, but it's been a long time. And back at that time, when the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was the same, there were alligators in Antarctica and camels in the Arctic, and it was a very, very different planet. And so all the regularities, all the things that we have depended upon and taken for granted, even in our mythologies, because mythology is about eternally recurring patterns. All of this is over.
Mhm.
So we're dealing with a nonlinear situation, an unpredictable climate, although we do understand more or less how things are going to get more challenging, to put it mildly. And we do, ironically, we have the technology, we have the means to actually to reduce atmospheric carbon. Okay, the Drawdown Institute is an excellent source of information on this. And they published a book with 100 different ways that we could be doing this, which include agriculture, aquaculture, industry, transportation, and so on and so forth. There's lots of ways to do this. But of course, so obviously here, so ecological science, environmental science, absolutely essential. They understand very well that we're dealing with a nonlinear system, an unpredictable situation, but the more information that we can gain, the more that we can understand the very, very profound, complex interplay of all the different things going on in the Earth system, the better off we'll be, because the more we'll maybe find a way to become a more resilient society, if not one that might possibly flourish.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a pessimist. Actually, I'm developing a course right now on the genre of what's called solar punk. Have you heard of the genre of solar punk?
Not so much.
Solar punk is very interesting because, of course, right now, a lot of our, literature and television and cinema is very, very happy giving us dystopian visions of the future, whether it be a zombie apocalypse or an asteroid Earth or this or that. It's always dystopian. But there's a counter genre, and it's called solar punk. And it's not Pollyanna, okay? It's not naively utopian. Rather, it tries to look at the world with realistic eyes and imagine a better possible world, and as importantly, how we might possibly get there. Okay. Two good examples. One is by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's The Ministry for the Future. It's a bestseller. Are you familiar with that book? Have you heard of that book?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's written from the point of view of 2050, and it's frighteningly prophetic in some of its descriptions of the sufferings that may not occur in Pakistan and India, but maybe in the American Southwest or parts of Europe, the way that the heat waves are going. But it imagines not a rosy future, but one where we've arrived, we've come through. Yanis Varoufakis has written a similar book, right? The Minister for the Economy of the old Greek government. He's written a utopian novel with the same basic premise. So I think right now, if there's anything important, it's for the sort of hard sci-fi, if you will, right? A science fiction or a speculative fiction that's as realistic as possible, as well informed as possible, but as imaginative as possible for ways that we can come out of this. That's the function of art right now, is imagination. The function of the intellect must be criticism, critique. And that's, of course, what I'm up to at the Skunk Works in my own weird way, picking away at, at the UFO mythology.
Mm-hmm. Now, are you a fan of Slavoj Zizek's insights? And does he talk about UFOs at all?
Not to my knowledge. I wouldn't say I'm a fan. Slavoj Zizek is kind of the philosopher I read for fun. Zizek is, I can understand almost all of Zizek. I mean, sometimes he gets into some really deep stuff, and sometimes he veers off into Lacan. I don't understand Lacan. I'm the first one to admit that. But most of Zizek I can read with pleasure, and I can get something out of. Zizek is valuable because he'll always come up with a new way of looking at things, and he'll overturn certain pieties. Not in the way that Sam Harris might, or that Jordan Peterson might, or whomever. There's another fellow who's really irritating me, whose name eludes me. I wonder why. So he'll come up with, he's a good ideas guy. He's a good ideas guy. Not all of his ideas are good ideas, but he's a good ideas guy. So yeah, I've got a great bunch of Slavoj Zizek up here. The great thing about Zizek is he's not so much a synthesizer of Marx and Lacan, which follows in the steps of the Frankfurt School, which tried to bring together Marx and Freud and others, and Erich Fromm, right? He was part of that for a while. But he's also comes out of German idealism, which is a very, very important resource for thinking. And it's really a site of intellectual foment and ideas and theories and arguments that a lot of our thinking has yet to transcend. And there are historical reasons for that. So I hold Zizek with some value, and I'm always looking forward to finding some new book by Zizek I haven't read.
Mhm.
But he does not talk about UFOs to my knowledge, which is interesting because he's not afraid of pop culture at all.
Yeah. He talks a lot about movies and stuff.
A lot about movies and stuff. They Live is his favorite movie, a great
Yeah.
science by John Carpenter, and there are aliens in there. But UFOs as such, I'm not aware. And maybe it's coming. The more it gets the airplay and press.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting if somebody could, or he could, sort of talk about his ideas and how UFOs might fit into them.
Yes.
Now, have you read the work of Jules Evans, who runs the Philosophy for Life website? He's a practitioner of Western spiritualism, but he also sees many of the dangers in spiritualism.
He writes a lot about spiritual eugenics. Is that the fellow?
Yeah, he's got a brilliant series on spiritual eugenics, and which is the overlap between eugenics ideas and New Age spiritualism.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that that overlap is in some way inherent to the logic of New Age spiritualism, or is it merely implicitly an implicit potential?
I'd be very hesitant to make any generalizations about quote-unquote New Age phenomenon. It's very various, and it goes back at least 50 years. And I'm sure that anything that I might say that's a generalization could be countered by someone who's taken the time to actually study the phenomenon. And there are scholars who are specialists in this. It is the case that there is an overlap, as you note, between spiritual eugenics and certain New Age tendencies and thoughts and beliefs. I think that is related to a certain notion of evolution that I touched on earlier. The idea that human beings, again, the notion of the New Age is not exactly utopian. It's I think the expression is chiliastic. That there's a new world coming, but it's not a new society, but a radically new metaphysical order. And so among some New Age groups or in some New Age beliefs, there's the talk of moving to a quote unquote higher frequency, that the chosen will ascend to the fifth dimension, that they will leave their body or the body will be changed radically. And of course, this echoes the book of Revelation in Christianity, where at the end of the world, there's a new heaven and a new earth, and indeed a new flesh that is not subject to the sufferings and limitations of my flesh and your flesh, corruption. So because it has this idea of betterment, improvement, radical change, you can see, I think, without too much imagination, how that lends itself to a kind of eugenics, as in part because of the basic drive, the goal, the worldview there, in part because of certain interpretations of even the DNA, right? Is that, well, DNA has certain frequencies and the double helix is like the twin snakes. And the thing about New Age thought, or New Age myth or New Age belief, I'm not sure what word to give it, but that body is, of course, it operates at a very poetic level, where one image dovetails into another, and ultimately all things are related to all other things. And it's highly irrational in that way, but that is its rationality, right? That's its logic. So I would think that there's a harmony, if you will, between certain New Age sentiments and certain eugenic sentiments. But I'd be very hesitant to posit any necessity there, but there's no doubt that it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But-
many important thinkers, the Huxleys, for example,
Yes.
and that many others were in both camps, eugenics and New Age.
Yes. Well, the problem with eugenics is that it hasn't left us.
Yeah.
I mean, eugenics is at work in those cultures that will choose to abort a female fetus over a male fetus.
Mm-hmm.
Eugenics is at work, in a sense, when a couple chooses to abort a fetus with Down syndrome or some other congenital defect or any other thing, aspect that they perhaps the child will be born blind. For reasons they don't feel they can handle that, or they don't want that, and therefore they'll choose against letting that fetus come to term. That's the eugenic decision. Things become all the more critical as our ability to diagnose conditions in utero increase, and our ability to treat conditions in utero increases. And as our ability to engineer human beings. So this is not, it's not exactly transhumanism, it's pre-transhumanism. I mean, and this was, of course, this was much more debated in the 90s and early 2000s. Again, Habermas writes a very interesting book about this problem, about genetic manipulation and genetic engineering. And he's against it, mainly because it takes away the freedom of choice from the being engineered, right? You're choosing for a life what color of eyes it will have, how tall it might be, and so on. And that's the sort of question that really should be left in the hands of the individual to make for him, her, themselves. That's, in a nutshell, the argument he makes. So on the one hand, there's just very, very coarse eugenics, like those based on chronology, right? Back in the 18th century, and these kinds of people, like the very, very coarse eugenics as part of social Darwinism, that we still find echoed, right? We still find it echoed, even in the discourse of American social policy and in other places. It's really, really distasteful. And you almost want to, and the thing is that you would be on good grounds to dispense with any pretense of eugenics at all, because we've realized since the time that we mapped the human genome that the gene is not the determining factor, that epigenetics plays a profoundly, profoundly powerful role in the way that an organism develops. Certain genes express themselves, certain ones do not for different reasons, and it's much, much, much more complex than geneticists believed even in the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons, that's one reason I remain skeptical of genetic engineering in general. My more profound reasons are the way that it's caught up in monoculture and agricultural monopolies. But so yes, I mean, the moment that we came up with the notion of evolution, right? The notion we came up with, the notion that we began to think of humans in terms of their breeds, that we might breed, right? Qualities in and out of the human population. I wonder if that was around before the so-called Enlightenment, because that sounds a lot like what Michel Foucault would refer to as biopower. With the rise of the modern nation state and the bureaucracy that goes with it, the relation to human populations became precisely this very agricultural one, where you're treating the human population almost as a herd animal.
Yeah.
Right? And questions of health and disease and hygiene and so on are cast in these terms. And that would lay the groundwork and open the door to the kind of eugenics that finds its language in the post-Darwinian moment, right? And of course, biopower and biopolitics is all the more present and powerful today for various reasons. But notice there that that's outside of the realm of certain New Age beliefs, right? That's right at the heart of the technocratic project, right? And so again, we're back in the hands of those number crunchers that advised, let's say it was Kennedy, that the Americans could win a nuclear war. They'd only lose 50 million people in the first strike. And so here again, we see the space wherein the imagination that the grays are from the future when our post-humanism has gone a step too far, coming into play.
Yep.
Yeah. It's again, the theme has vista, but it's all one horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's the role of conspiracy theory in reasserting the possibility of agency?
What is the role of conspiracy theory in reasserting the, oh, I think I see what you mean. So if I understand you correctly, an example might be that some actors in the American context feel that they regain the agency they felt they had lost by espousing something like QAnon, which gives them the key to understanding what's really going on. Is that kind of the drift of your question?
Yeah, and also the possibility of overthrowing the cabal, which is supposedly running everything, who is imagined to have agency, even if nobody else does, even if the population is basically enslaved.
Yes.
The masters, whoever they are, still have agency, and if you can overthrow them, then you can regain it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, conspiracy theory is the poor man's ideology critique.
Right.
But it very, very coarsely. Look, anyone who claims they understand what's going on is lying to you. As I say, as history, again, this is a kind of a Hegelian Marxist insight. As history unfolds, it unfolds in a chaotic, aleatoric fashion. It's only after the fact when we look back and in a very abstract way, right, relate certain events to other events, that we begin to come up with a story that makes sense of it. So, those Russian soldiers that were putting the machine gun up on top of the Winter Palace in 1917, they had no idea they were in the middle of a revolution. It actually took someone at a certain moment to say, oh, it's a revolution. Oh, it's a revolution. And so we can understand that in an increasingly interconnected and increasingly complex and increasingly opaque world, and in a world where more and more of us, and myself included, feel that our agency, like a lot of us will feel, I believe, that each of us singly can't, don't, and won't make a difference. I mean, I see what's going on in the world, and I try to wonder, well, what kind of possible intervention can I make to make any difference at all, right? And that we pose that for each ourselves is in part of the problem and a function of the society, which atomizes its members into individual consumers and individual citizens and individual subjects. And so Kells agrees that in that situation, especially those who feel their way of life threatened, whether it be their national identity, their gender identity, what they conceive of as their racial identity, their sort of cultural identity. We think here of people who fly the Confederate flag, for example, that they should grasp all the more desperately and embrace all the more happily any map that gives them a sense that they really understand what's going on, and that therefore they can do something, and that gives them the courage and the motivation to like storm the Capitol on January 6th, or here in Canada, occupy the Capitol over the winter. So what's interesting here is that the conspiracy theories, ironically, perhaps because of the, it's funny, I want to say because of their simplicity, but they're not simple. QAnon is an insanely complicated theory, but its basic theses are simple, are as simple as they're insane, right? The thing about the conspiracy theory is it enables agency because it simplifies the problem into a Manichaean situation. Where there's it's the Jews, it's the cabal, it's whomever, right? So first of all, you've got someone you can blame everything, and then you can smash their shop windows, you can throw things at them, you can kick them in the street. Right, like there was a poor woman of Chinese descent here in Canada who was kicked in the street during the worst of the COVID outbreak because the person believed that, oh, it was the Chinese were to blame. Right? It allows you to it gives you a target, it gives you something to do, and those of us who are as concerned, but a bit more appreciative of the complexities of the situation, certainly can appreciate the desire to act, but are of course held back because we're not too sure exactly how to act, and how to act in a way that is consistent with our own moral sensibility and our own sense of what can be accomplished. Yeah. That would be my way of looking at it. There is a course, there is a post at Skunkworks blog where I try to at least go down the rabbit hole. The word rabbit hole is in the title of the blog post. I think it's like shining a flashlight down the rabbit hole or something like that. And this was soon after the this was in the wake of the January 6th uprising. And I was trying to get my brain around, well, what is in fact going on? And ironically, I blame it on the Enlightenment. The basic argument is that since the Reformation, especially, the unity of the truth and the unity of reason has been fractured and atomized. So with the Reformation, suddenly each believer, through the grace of the Holy Spirit and their own belief, is enabled to interpret the Bible on their own. They don't need a learned elite who can actually read the ancient languages and has some philological sense to help them suss out what it means. So right there, and this is why there's like one Roman Catholic Church, but there are thousands of different Protestant denominations and sects, because ultimately under Protestantism and under that way of looking at things, each person is his or her own conscience and his or her own adjudicator when it comes to the meaning of the Bible. And so you can see right there, right, the root tip of the notion of fake news, or the sort of postmodern version of truth that we find articulated by the Russian thinker we were talking about earlier, that you have your truth and I have my truth. With the Enlightenment, you had the notion of sapere aude, think for yourself. But of course, the person saying that, writing that, was writing it in Latin, and he was writing it, from out of and within the context of a learned community, of a literate community of people with whom you could talk among each other. But okay, so you have the Reformation, you have the notion of sapere aude with the Enlightenment, you have the scientific revolution, ironically, which leads to the further fracturing of truth, because the last time we tried to even imagine that the scientists might cohere in a unified vision of reality was at the end of the 19th century. And since then, we realized that the individual sciences all go off each in their own little way, and there's not one unity, one reality to which to which they all adhere. There's almost a pluralism or a relativism at a certain level. They're all very powerful. The powers of the sciences is precisely their ability to specialize and focus and break problems down into ever more finer parts. But then, okay, what then is the relationship between chemistry and physics? What is the relationship between psychology and physics? We can't tie it together anymore. So the sciences blow reality apart. The Reformation blows belief apart. The Enlightenment asks each subject to think for him or her or themselves. Then capitalism, furthermore, right, atomizes us into smaller and smaller groups. And you wonder why identity politics is so powerful today. Well, it's precisely because it answers the atomization of society into consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have this need to belong. And the thing is that capitalism, there's a weird dialectic that groups which are interpolated, kind of identified, called out, grouped by the society, say like homosexual men. Homosexual men get interpolated and excluded from consumption, from work, and right, because of their sexual orientation. Then, thankfully, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, okay, because of certain political action, that interpolated group then seizes its own group identity and turns it around, and is now a market, right? Capitalism doesn't care, right? Capitalism is all too glad whenever any group that is excluded affirms its identity and comes into the fold, because then it can be sold to and it can be turned in, it can itself be commodified, yeah. Right? So it's in this foment, in this infinitely atomized situation, in this, okay, so it's this atomization of what? Of knowledge, of worldview, of truth, of what have you, that lays the groundwork for the possibility of the atomization of truth, of fake news, and so on and so forth, and its abuse and exploitation by actors who want to exploit it for their own ends. At the same time, it's also the inheritance of Enlightenment that gives us the possibility for healing the wound that the Enlightenment itself inflicted on reason, because it's the very notion of the possibility of universal reason, the fact that even those in the most profound conflicts must be sharing some assumptions or they wouldn't be in conflict at all, right? This is a hermeneutic idea, which comes out of the study of the Bible, and so on. So it's a wonderfully dialectical and complex situation, but you can see, okay, we live in a really complicated world where everyone is for him or her or themselves, and you wonder why certain people who feel themselves under threat or disenfranchised, as many Americans rightfully do, right? Mm-hmm. In Canada, I mean, I can't begin to understand, I can't begin to know the sufferings, the material sufferings, the material deprivations that so many Americans are subject to, without minimum wage laws, without universal medical care, without access to housing. So many of the things that I as a Canadian can take for granted are simply absent in the United States. And the precarity, the profound precarity and anxiety that this must inspire is just beyond my imagination. And you wonder why people get desperate, and you wonder why people get violent. And you wonder why they listen to anyone who will give them a simple way out. Yes. Make America great again, you know? Holy smokes. And of course, here in Canada, we're not immune to that either. Don't get me wrong. Here, in most, I don't know a single so-called developed world country where the social safety net that was so hard won, first by the blood shed by the labor movement, and second by the gains made by the labor movement after the Second War, right? All those gains that were in place up until about 1975 have been worn away and ripped away and degraded under the fetishization of the market, as we began to talk about at the beginning, of neoliberalism. And this only leads to desperation. This only leads to anxiety. This only leads to precarity at a time when that's the last thing we need.
Mm-hmm.
So little wonder that quote unquote conspiracy theories find a place and inspire people to act, even if it's the right move in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Ironically, the veneration of somebody like Trump, who is, I think his cabinet had more billionaires in it than any other cabinet in US history. And yet he's seen as some sort of hero of the working class.
Yes.
By the people who support him.
Yes. Well, the same with Nazis, right?
Yeah.
The capitalist class was all too happy to have the Nazis come into power because they were anti-labor and they were anti-Bolshevik.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very famous collage of the Führer with making his salute, not the stiff arm salute, but the one where he throws his hand over his shoulder.
Yeah.
Of course, leaning over his shoulder is an arm in a business suit holding a big bag of Reichsmarks, putting it in that open hand.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
So a lot of corporations made a killing in the Third Reich.
Now, getting back to SETI.
Yes.
This will be the second last question. Can we? You've written a little bit about SETI on your blog. Well, quite a bit actually, but you've written about how we often sort of project our own colonialist tendencies onto what ET life might be like, alien civilizations. And do you think that there are any sort of boundaries which we should place on how we think about extraterrestrial life? And some of the depictions of aliens in movies, like in Predator, where you've got that hunter who comes to Earth and tracks down the commandos in the Central American jungle
with the dreadlocks.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you think that sort of thing is that all bets are off when we're thinking about alien civilizations, or are there some scientific constraints that can actually be placed on the nature of these civilizations?
Ooh, okay. Well, there's a number of concerns packed into this question. I haven't touched so much on the colonial dimensions of SETI and imagining extraterrestrials. There are a couple of examples. The first is that often the comparison is made, and even Stephen Hawking made this comparison, that should human beings experience a more or encounter a more advanced extraterrestrial race, Earthlings would be like those peoples of the so-called New World of the Americas that encountered the Europeans.
Yeah.
You know how that worked out. That's one obviously colonially inflected way of thinking about things that I've touched on in the blog. When it comes to the representation of aliens as racialized others, I mean, you can also think of Avatar.
Mm-hmm.
This was recently touched on in this paper I remarked earlier by Joshua Schuster. And he explores that a little bit. And actually, many scholars, many BIPOC scholars, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color, they're the first to point out how the alien bears way too many resemblances to racialized, othered peoples on Earth. Now, I haven't probed that very far. My concern is actually a lot more along the lines of a parrot. There's a parrot in a story by Ted Chiang, I think his name is pronounced. He's the man who wrote the short story upon which the Denis Villeneuve movie Contact is based.
Uh-huh.
Okay, he writes a wonderful story, and it's set in Puerto Rico, in the grounds of the Arecibo telescope. And the narrator is this Puerto Rican parrot. And the Puerto Rican parrot is one of a vanishing breed of parrot in Puerto Rico. And he's like one of the last 6 or so. And he's telling the story of his interaction with this biologist who's learning to speak with him. And of course, you can begin to understand, you can sort of see where this story is going, because the Puerto Rican parrot is puzzled and saddened by how human beings are looking out into outer space and distant planets and stars and asteroids for other forms of life, when the intelligent forms of life that are already here, like himself, are being liquidated on a daily basis.
Yeah.
This is really, my my approach to the matter of SETI. SETI, of course, is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In that acronym is, of course, the notion of intelligence. Intelligence exclusively is conceived of the intelligence or the kind of reason that gives rise to the kind of society that looks for itself on other planets by means of radio telescopes, by means of telescopes, etc. SETI is looking for ourselves. In doing so, it has fetishized one way human beings have found to be on the earth. They have normalized and treated as a cosmic norm a societal accident, which is namely the social formation of the so-called advanced societies. It's not the only way that human beings live on Earth. It may not be the way that human beings continue to live on the Earth. I always point out that the longest lived continuous civilization on Earth is that of the Australian Aborigine. They have been living the way they've been living, to put it very, very roughly, this is back there are caveats here, for 60,000 years. There are animals that are depicted in their petroglyphs. There are animals that are described in their songs that went extinct 50, 60,000 years ago. So they're the longest lived civilization on the planet. And their technology consists of an elaborate oral culture. And they're able to live in the most forbidding part of the planet. In this war, Australian pilots returning from fighting in the Pacific Theater would often crash land in the outback, and the first ones to do so would die of thirst and hunger. And so the Australian armed forces and the Allied armed forces figured, well, there are some people we know who can live out there. They're the Aborigine. Why don't we have them give our pilots some survival training? And of course, to the Aborigine, the outback is a supermarket. Whereas to you or me, it's a forbidding desert and our tomb. So this is the problem with SETI is the way that it fetishizes, right, technological society. And you find this played out in the Drake equation, you find this played out in the Kardashev scale. And all of this interest is at the expense of a more robust, a more realistic, a more refined, a more fine-grained, a more humane, and a more universal concept of what it means to be intelligent. Intelligence is not just the quote-unquote intelligence of the most gifted engineer at Google. Intelligence includes the way that the linden tree outside my window successfully lives as it does and communicates to the wood wide web to all the other trees in the vicinity. Intelligence includes the way the chickadees on the mountain here know where they stash their seeds and hide their seeds in a way that you and I could never do. and their competition is with the memory of the squirrels. The more you look into what constitutes intelligence, sentience, or consciousness, you see that it extends to every living thing. The moment you do it without blinders or anthropocentrism. This is the blindness of SETI. Our world teems. It teems with intelligent life.
Would you nevertheless expect spacefaring technological civilizations to have certain attributes or to not have certain attributes?
That's a good question. It's curious. I mean, and again, this is one of the great questions of SETI research, is that of the great silence. Given the number of habitable planets of which we are aware, and given the length of time they've been around, we should have encountered some sign, some technological signature, but yet we haven't. And why that is of course, grist for the mill. I am much more amenable to the speculations of people such as William S. Burroughs and Terence McKenna, that space travel is achieved not through technological means, but through, shall we say, other means. And of course, I'm not alone in that. Recently, under the tutelage and guidance of Rick Strassman, one of the people to do some of the most important and groundbreaking research into DNT. There's a group in Colorado, I think they are, who's developing a way for psychonauts to remain under a state of DNT intoxication for an extended period of time. Should they begin to explore those quote unquote hyperspaces in ways that the brevity of the DMT experience hitherto has disallowed. Spacefaring civilizations. You see, ironically, you would almost want to say, or I would almost want to say that, you know, if we do encounter spacefaring civilizations, their vehicles would be much more like the psychic interpretation of UFOs, where perhaps the UFO is itself a life form, or perhaps the UFO is more like ectoplasm than a Gemini capsule, splitting apart, passing through air, water, earth indifferently, popping in and out of existence, growing in size, diminishing in size, appearing metallic, but at the same time operating as if it's something absolutely immaterial. And so completely out of our ken and beyond our understanding. See, this kind of comes around. You would say that it's precisely the irrationality, the paradoxality, the absurdity of UFOs, if we take them at face value, that points to their profound otherness. But it's not the otherness that is reduced so savagely and stupidly by disclosure, that imagines that these 50-odd races that Michael Salla imagines are visiting us, and Corey Good describes, they're all human, all too human. So I wouldn't expect anything like that at all. I think when it comes to being interplanetary, as I've stated earlier today, we're already colonizing a new planet. And maybe the aliens that we have to concern ourselves with are ourselves on this new planet that we have to learn to live on.
Yes. And finally, could you read one of your poems, please?
I'm going to read a poem that is perhaps all too fitting.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Flying Saucers, and it recounts that great inaugural experience, whose anniversary, I we just passed, indeed. So it's called Flying Saucers. Tuesday, 3 in the afternoon, the 24th of June, 1947. Kenneth Arnold of Boise, rescue pilot, businessman, deputy sheriff and federal marshal, U.S. Forest Serviceman. At 9,000 feet, crystal clear conditions, alone in his call air between Cahalis and Yakima. An hour's detour searching for a lost transport. Out of the blue, a flash, like just before a midair crash, made him look left, north of Mount Rainier, to see at 90 degrees, 9 seeming jet planes in a V pointed south. The echelon vaguely bobbing and weaving, flashing reflections 24 miles off. Against Rainier snows, tailless, flying the nearly 40 miles between Mounts Rainier and Adams, 3 times the speed of sound. The first crossed the ridge, bridging the mountains, as the last came over its north crest, 5 miles back. 9 crescents needing to be half a mile long to be seen, flying that fast, that far away. So smooth, mirroring sunlight, like speedboats on rough water, wavering in formation, like the tail of a Chinese kite, wings tipping, flashing blue-white, each like a saucer skipped over water.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And you've got many more poems, which we can find online where?
At skunkworksblog.com.
Mm-hmm. And you've also written some books with your poems as well.
Yeah, you can find some of those poems and some of them being recorded at Poeta Doctus, which is BryanSentes.com, I think. But look up Poeta Doctus, look up Bryan Sentes, and that's the website devoted to my poetry there. And there's that poem there is from my first book, Grand Gnostic Central. There's another book called Ladonian Magnitudes, which has a poem about Magonia in it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a third book, March End Prill, which came out in 2011. There are a couple of other manuscripts in circulation. And then, of course, the great epic work, which I'm working on, tentatively entitled Orthotony, which is my attempt to do for the UFO mythology what Ovid did for the mythology of his day in the Metamorphoses.
Well, I'll be sure to put all those links in the description to the video.
Thank you.
And Bryan, I think I'll let you go.
Okay, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you so much. And I hope we can continue it relatively soon.
Well, you know, the theme has vista and there's always new things coming up.
Yes, very true.
Watch the skies.
Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Thank you.